You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Hi, this is Zed Jelani. I'm an investigative blogger and campaigner with the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, and today I'll be hosting a show in memoriam of Michael Hastings, a man that I'm sure many people listening remember very, very fondly, and who, we're all saddened to hear about his death earlier this week. I'll be joined by three activists and journalists. And just to start us off, I just want to say a few words from my own thoughts. I met Hastings, I think it was about 3 years ago. It was about when, right after he published his article about General McChrystal, and McChrystal had resigned. All of D.C. was abuzz about who is this Michael Hastings. And, I just met him one afternoon. He wanted to meet me. I was working at the Center for American Progress for Think Progress at the time. And I was just struck by, not only how remarkable this man was in his journalistic talent, just how knowledgeable he was, but just, how humble he was, how much he wanted to learn from me, how much he wanted to learn from everyone else. And so, when I heard this news, I was incredibly saddened. And I'm sure there's many people now who are just thinking about, the memories of Hastings and what he did for journalism and what he did for the country, really, in his writing. Like I said, we'll be joined by three people this hour. First, we have Stephen Miles from Win Without War. Stephen, are you on?
Yeah, hi.
Hey, Stephen. Do you want to just say a few words, like your reaction to Hastings' death earlier this week? What you remembered about him and what he did for journalism, and but particularly what he did for the Afghan war and ending the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I will confess that I wasn't fortunate enough to know Michael particularly well, but I will say that his death, came as quite a shock and a surprise. Obviously, he was a very young man and a journalist at the height of his art, and it'll be quite a hole to fill in his profession and for all those who knew him.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. I mean, I think particularly for myself, I mean, just following his work even before the McChrystal story, just saw sort of an aggressiveness that you just don't get from journalists these days. Also on the line right now is Rania Khalek, who's a great independent journalist whose work I followed for quite a few years as well. Rania, are you on?
Yeah. Hey.
Hey, Rania. So, when you heard about, about the terrible car crash in Los Angeles, I mean, what were your immediate thoughts? I mean, what did we lose? What did all of us lose this week?
Well, I mean, I had the opportunity to meet Michael on a couple occasions, and like your other guest was saying, I mean, he was really such a down-to-earth person for such a high-profile journalist. Of all the really well-known journalists I've met, it was like he really didn't put himself above anybody. One really amazing thing about him is that once he became really well known, he started to have so much access to people in power that a lot of aggressive journalists like him don't usually get. And one thing that I thought was really amazing about Hastings is that he never changed. He kept being aggressive. Like, he was never out to make friends or rub elbows with people in positions of authority, which I think is so unfortunately rare right now in journalism, especially for the beat he was covering. I mean, he had like the war beat and the national security beat, and I mean, those two areas, I mean, most of what you get from, the mainstream press is a lot of it is, just kind of stenography and just repeating what they're told by, trying not to embarrass people in power. And Michael is the exact opposite of that, and that's one thing that's really lacking, and it's really such a loss for journalism.
No, there's no doubt about that. Also on the line is Joe McCare, who works at Truth Out, which publishes fantastic progressive journalism every single day. Joe, what was your main reaction to what happened this week? In what way, should all of us in the progressive community particularly be knowing about what we lost this week?
Thanks. Well, I should start by saying that obviously it's a human tragedy, and for anyone of his age to kind of go before their time is upsetting, and my immediate thoughts were for the friends that we had in common, and his family. But it is also true, I think, that obviously no journalist would you say, is replaceable in a situation like this, but Michael Hastings was kind of an anomaly, kind of a one-off. I mean, the fact that he was doing in mainstream media outlets, essentially, such good work, the fact that he was able to kind of balance having access and knowing when to burn bridges and when to kind of use that access to actually get, important information out there. It was really, really quite an individual thing. I think that his work kind of stands as an example and a challenge, not just to the mainstream media, but to the independent media as well. I mean, we need more like him. We need to be publishing more stuff of that caliber. When the first time I actually met him was during the NATO summit in Chicago last year, and he was the only journalist I knew who was actually in town to cover the summit itself rather than just the protests. Or rather, he was the only journalist I knew who was actually covering both, who had got the credentials to go in, but he was quite dismissive about the rest of the credentialed press corps, who were just happy to get the kind of NATO press releases and retype them. And he wanted to actually go out and sort of see the protests that were going on, hang out with the scrappier freelance journalists who'd come to cover the protests. So, I mean, that's another example that he was just kind of unique in his place in the media landscape, and so especially hard to replace.
I couldn't agree more, and I think one really, really good look into his mentality is actually, if you go back, there was this website that hosted a series of blogs that actually merged with Forbes later on, but it was called Trueslant, and I blogged there for a while. Michael Hastings also blogged there for a while, and he had a post. Let me see what it was titled. It was called OTF When Michael Moore Yelled at Me. It was published, October 2009. So, more than 3.5 years ago. And basically he talks for most of the post about how he was sort of reporting on the campaign trail in 2003. And he, sort of picked up the conventional wisdom. Michael Moore's a radical, so he kind of said, you're endorsing General Wesley Clark for the Democratic primary in the presidential race. Won't that hurt him? And Michael Moore sort of went off on him. And, he's sort of reflecting on that moment here, saying that, maybe he was wrong to pick up on the conventional wisdom. Maybe Michael Moore isn't, an extremist. Rather, he's someone that actually represents a lot of people in the mainstream. And this was the sort of self-reflection that any good journalist takes part in. But really what I want to highlight in this post is a section where Hastings sort of reflects on our wider politics, which is something you didn't see him do that often. You saw him more like, he would aggressively tackle a subject like the war in Afghanistan or the 2012 presidential race. But this was really sort of a broader narrative on American politics. And, he concluded by saying this, it's clear that the biggest division in this country isn't the Ann Coulter / Michael Moore split. It's the elite versus the non-elite. Personally, I'm much more comfortable with the views of Ron Paul and Ralph Nader, supposedly opposite sides of the political spectrum, than I am with almost any two establishment candidates of either party. Because what Paul, Nader, Chomsky, Moore, and even to a certain extent and degree, depending on his mood, Glenn Beck or Pat Buchanan, remind us repeatedly is that it's not a left-right thing, it's an elite, non-elite thing. And that's where I want to go back to you, Stephen. I really, after I met Hastings, after he published his story about McChrystal, that's really the mentality I feel like he attacked this issue with. There were so many people who, after the McChrystal story went out, so many journalists who said, oh, I heard generals say the same thing, but I didn't think we were supposed to report on that. But, he was the guy who was willing to report on the stuff McChrystal was saying about the Obama administration, undermining them, and the entire, Pentagon campaign to undermine Obama. So, Stephen, say a few words about sort of that mentality of how Hastings tackled the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point to that. I think what the genius of that article wasn't that he found out something that nobody else knew. It was actually that he found something that a lot of people knew but weren't willing to report on. And it's something that, you know, as the other guys were talking about, it's something that kind of permeated his career, and you know, whether it was his work exposing kind of psyops in Afghanistan, psychological operations, or other war writings. A lot of this stuff happens in plain sight, and it kind of happens with the agreed upon silence. To use the phrase you were just using, the agreed upon silence of the elites, and it's kind of something that theoretically they all know and they agree not to talk about, but that the vast majority of people out there have no idea what's going on, and quite frequently that the reality is something exactly like what he reported with McChrystal, is that they have, these elites then have contempt for everyone else because they think they know more, they think they know better. And it was Michael's genius to open that window into the arrogance, open that window into that unspoken world that hides in plain sight for members of those circles, that I think was so eye-opening and such a profoundly impactful piece of reporting, and we're all a lot better off for it, and it continues to be the case, unfortunately, that far too many journalists don't question that. They, as was said, just repeat the press releases they get. They take the military or what have you, whatever the institution they're covering, at their word, and we need journalists like Michael Hastings who remind us that there's another perspective, and to bring the rest of us, the American people, into these conversations as well, because we have a rightful place in there.
You know, Ronnie, as a fellow journalist and as someone who's been writing on not only national security issues for years, but also just other issues where you see these clashes between elites and non-elites. I think it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about. I don't know if you saw this, but the New York Times published an obituary of Hastings actually yesterday, and a section of it, it basically said that his blockbuster article that led to the resignation of McChrystal, that it would have been picked apart by a Department of Justice IG report that said that there wasn't actually any evidence of wrongdoing from what McChrystal did, so on and so forth. It actually provoked a very sharp response from Hastings' wife and also from a number of media watchdogs who point out that wasn't even accurate. Ronnie, what do you think it is about other journalists who are responding to Hastings in that way? I mean, do you think that people at the New York Times just aren't used to people who are as aggressive as Hastings, or what is it? What provokes that kind of response in an obituary?
Well, I think that there is like a certain amount of when it comes to mainstream journalists, and this isn't all of them, but for the most part, at least mainstream outlets tend to be, like, we're talking about the elites versus the non-elites. The mainstream outlets tend to be more a part of the elite group than the non-elite group, and there's very little diversity. Not just mainstream outlets, but all outlets, particularly mainstream outlets, especially like class diversity, that a lot of times, at least like what I observe is, the journalists, there's like a certain kind of like etiquette that they have where, unless it comes down as a confirmation from, someone in a position of authority, or unless like the Pentagon says it's so, then it's not so until they say it is. And they sort of like and I mean, the New York Times does this a lot. They won't say, and it's not that you shouldn't receive confirmation, it's just they depend on authorities to confirm things, like, all the time. And unless the Pentagon says, or the Defense Department says that what Hastings said happened word for word, they'll continue to say, it's like inaccurate, or they're not sure about it. That's just the way it seems to work. And I think a lot of it's because they're sort of coming from the same class of people, the same circle of people. Like, they're all friends and buddies, and I mean, they a lot of times the people in journalism and the officials that they're supposed to be covering, a lot of times, like, they invite each other to their parties. They have get-togethers. They're like, godmothers and godfathers of each other's kids. I mean, it's just kind of like this circle. And it's the same with the private industry too, which is why it's so difficult for I think the media these days to do its job, because there's so few journalists who are willing to burn bridges, not just with people in power, but people who are like just like them, people who are like in their circle and are kind of like a part of their group of friends, or have to do with people who are friends of groups of friends. And I think that's what is really like amazing about Michael, is he was in a position where he could have been just like that, but instead he chose to really focus on telling the story behind the story and telling the story of the people who were like, suffering because of the story, whether it's like drone victims, or whether I remember this one time at a Netroots conference I was at. There was this panel on drone strikes. It was last year. I think Joe McRae, you were there. And
Yep.
Of all the people on the panel, they were all less like leaning type liberals, good Democrats, and most of them were basically defending drone strikes and defending the drone program. And Michael Hastings was the only person on that panel to say anything against it and to be honest about it. I think the reason they were defending it is because they're so invested in the Obama administration and so invested in the Democrats, and because this is their policy now, they want to make sure that they agree with it. And so that's what I'm talking about, is this idea of sort of like defending those who you believe are in your inner circle and being a part of that elite group, And Michael Hastings wasn't afraid to bring a backlash against him. He didn't care. He was honest to whoever was in power, and I think that's what's really missing. And I think that's oftentimes why you see so few in the mainstream willing to go against sort of the tide of popular elite opinion is.
That's a really, it's a really interesting point you make about drones. In April of 2012, he actually published a really great article in Rolling Stones called "The Rise of the Killer Drones: How America Goes to War in Secret." And it's really fascinating because he got the sort of the full picture in a way really I haven't seen in very many drone articles. Everyone from the people on the ground in the DC area who operate the drones, to people in the White House and CIA sources, to going to Nasser al-Awlaki, the father and grandfather of drone victims in Yemen. I mean, he got the full picture. And Joe, this is something I want you to maybe expand about. Is how did a journalist who was this critical of the establishment and this sort of dissident in sort of his views, how did he get sources like this? I mean, typically, when I'm reporting something and the source knows that I'm critical of their policy, they don't want to talk to me at all, right? So how did Hastings do this? What kind of gift did he have? He must have had something.
I mean, having met him only a few times, but having talked a little with him about this, I think he also knew kind of when to keep his powder dry. I mean, when not to be a blowhard, in the sense that at the last time I saw him, he was working on his book about the 2012 election, specifically the Obama campaign, Panic 2012, and he was telling me that, what he said was essentially, if I'm covering the campaign and you get a chance to have a moment with the candidate, in this case the president, and you can ask them one question. If you ask a very combative question at that point that makes it clear what you think of their policies, the ones that you're most critical of, then they're never going to talk to you again. So I think that he knew when to kind of maintain certain relationships. I mean, clearly after the McChrystal story and after his reporting on Petraeus, there were definitely people within the military who weren't going to talk to him again. But I think that, he somehow managed to achieve a level of seriousness that meant that he was admitted to these circles. I guess a lot of the time it's because his reporting was actually very fact-based. I mean, you could kind of see the opinion there, obviously, and he was never shy about that when he went on television. But it was all very rooted in facts, and he was usually on these panels where he was the most opinionated person. He was usually also the most informed person. So I think that's a big part of it. I mean, there's a lot of journalists who kind of criticize establishment policy, and they're right to, but kind of do it in such a way that they'll never be given that kind of access. And there's a role for that. But to be able to get that access and then use it, for a good purpose like that is pretty rare.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And I recall when I met him that one of the major things that he said that made a good journalist is just being aggressive, constantly picking up the phone, calling again and again and again to get a source on the record, and just, sort of sticking it to people it's interesting because, you saw Hastings jump around also a lot in sort of the topics that he covered. He spent years in Iraq, sort of writing from there. He wrote a whole book about that. His fiancée was killed during the war tragically there. He covered the 2012 election with the Obama and Romney camps. And then, he had the beats going on in Hollywood, which is where he was this week when he passed away. And to me, to see a journalist like that be that prolific and still be able to be as critical as they are, to be as probing as they are, it's really remarkable. And it's something that we see in sort of few people today. Stephen, what would you say to other people who are working, let's say, in the progressive movement, people who are activists or advocacy journalists like I've been? What would you say they could learn from Hastings and they could apply to their own work?
I mean, I think building off what was just said, these things require persistence. They require continuing to ask questions, and when you think you've exhausted every avenue, asking even more questions and looking at it from another aspect. And I think that it requires not just doing that in a aggressive and partisan way, but really in looking for the truth. And I think that was when Hastings was at his best. That's what we saw. We saw an aggressive pursuit of the truth. And an unwillingness to kind of rest without it. And we just too often don't see that from journalists. And, a lot of us in the advocacy and activism world spend our time, spoon-feeding journalists stories about what are truly outrageous things, that if they pick up the phone and talk to more than the official spokesman, they would get 10 different sides of the story. And it's really hard. And a lot of journalists out there aren't interested in it. They just they want to make their deadline. They want to appease their publisher. They don't want to upset an advertiser. There's kind of a host of reasons. But what makes for truly great journalism is that fearless pursuit, an unrelenting pursuit of the truth that I think Michael showed a lot in his writing, and an openness to let a story take you where it goes. I think Michael's story about McChrystal is a classic example. He could have never in a million years gone into that reporting assignment thinking that was the story he was going to write. Events and the situation kind of conspired to result in what happened. And if he wouldn't have been open to that, if he would have been doggedly pursuing an angle or an aspect and not been open to the story that presented itself, he might never have found the story that he found, and history would be very different, and history would be worse because of it.
Yeah. No. Certainly. I think that really reflecting on this, I think even journalists who really just they didn't take his editorial view, and they didn't even like some of his writing. This week are looking back and saying that Hastings had so much under his belt for someone so young. I mean, he was 33 years old. I think it was Jeremy Scahill who tweeted that he got, I think it was a text message from an ex-JSOC guy, and JSOC is Joint Strike Operations Command. They run small units for tactical type warfare. That he had actually got Scahill got a text message from this gentleman, and it said that I didn't always agree with him, but man, he was great. That sort of, I think that sort of reflection is coming from so many people right now because the man has such a huge impact on what he did in such short years of his life. Rania, what would you say are the what practices of Michael would you say that journalists should pick up? What if you were the bureau chief of the New York Times somewhere and you wanted everyone to reflect on something this week, what would you want them to do?
Well, I would definitely first and foremost, ask tougher questions. Don't ask softball questions. Ask challenging, hard questions that need to be asked. A lot of these outlets have the access to people that we don't necessarily have access to. And I'm not saying they have to come at them even that aggressively. Just ask the questions. When it comes to drone strikes. Ask the challenging questions, like why did the administration why did the administration kill a 16-year-old Abdulrahman Al-Awlaki? Like, no one in the mainstream has asked that question. He was an American citizen, and I would urge my reporters to do things like that. Another thing is I would urge them to aggressively go after the truth. I think that's one thing that Michael definitely left an example for the rest of us, is like, go after the truth, keep asking questions, don't give up on a story, stay aggressive, keep making your phone calls. And then I think another thing that Joe keeps mentioning, which I think is so important, and something that like all of us, I could stand to learn from, is, Michael did have this ability to report the truth, even, and challenge authority, while at the same time maintaining this level of access and knowing when to burn his bridges. And I think that's something that's so rare, and it's not an easy thing to do. I would urge, if I was like the head of the New York Times, I would have like an entire discussion of the entire bureau about how we could do that. And that's so important.
No, and I think that I think that there probably are journalists everywhere who are asking themselves this right now, who are looking at Hastings' body of work and just thinking about how we can learn, because to me, even when I was reading short blog posts from him, 100 words, 200 words back in 2009, 2010, I felt like I was learning a lot, even from non-reported pieces, just the way that he thought, the way that he processed. I mean, one of the sort of tips he wrote once, sort of tips for young journalists or something like that. And one of the things that he said in there was put a fact in every sentence. Teach your audience something in every sentence. And I feel like he would do that not only in his reporting, but just in if he was writing a short blog post, if he was on television, giving his opinion about something. I feel like that was a constant thing with him. And I think, insofar as, I think, Joe, you mentioned earlier that he was never shy of giving his opinion. I think the final article that he wrote, I believe it was on BuzzFeed, and I think it was called "Why Democrats Love NSA Spying." And obviously, with the scandal of the past couple of weeks that Glenn Greenwald broke, of sort of the massive scale of indiscriminate spying by the NSA, I think in the light of that, I think we saw sort of a reflection from Hastings in that last article that he really wanted to pursue this, and he really wanted to get at the truth of this issue in a way that a lot of mainstream journalists, when they saw this story from Greenwald, just said, "Oh, we've known this is going on for a long time," or "It's not that big of a deal." So I guess my question is, Joe, do you think that Hastings was writing articles like that really took a blunt editorial view against the Democrats because he found himself disappointed with President Obama? And I mean, I remember one account from his 2012 book, I believe, or when he was on the Trail drafting it, as he actually told Rahm Emanuel that we'll see if Obama's worth re-electing, because he was talking about American soldiers who had died in Afghanistan for reasons Hastings didn't find justified. I mean, do you think that Hastings had a relationship with Obama where he really did feel conflicted about covering him and the way that he wrote about him? I mean, he wrote an entire book about the campaign, and now he came out with his last few articles being very, very critical of the Obama administration.
Well, I mean, I think there's several things going on. In just prior to the election, when I spoke to him in Chicago, he told me that he was, in a way, kind of rooting for Obama. He would rather have had Obama win than Romney, because he felt that Obama had surrounded himself with foreign policy advisors who would be reluctant to start a war with Iran. That didn't mean that they weren't going to do it, but they would be reluctant, whereas Romney's foreign policy people would actively seek war with Iran. Now, I think that what's going on with the revelations about the mass surveillance by the NSA is that, frankly, you can either have a fact-based view of it, or you can have a view of it which is extremely favorable to the current administration. I mean, I think that at this point the kind of people who are coming out saying, oh, this isn't that bad, especially the people who normally identify as liberals or progressives or leftists. I mean, that is something that's become divorced from factual reality. So, I mean, I think that the piece that Hastings wrote for BuzzFeed about why Democrats love to spy on Americans was, I mean, it's the result of years now of emerging evidence. It's hard to end up with a position if you're actually paying attention to facts and not having your view distorted by some kind of partisan loyalty. It's hard to pay attention to those facts and not come away with the opinion he had. I think that it's one of the many reasons that his passing is so devastating is that we are in the middle of a kind of process of further ratcheting down against critical reporting on these issues. There aren't that many people who are inclined to do it anyway because it's a lot less easy than doing puff pieces. And if you do it, you'll be at least smeared, and at worst, subject to actual forms of kind of state investigation and harassment. So, I mean, he talks in that piece about the private contracting firm HB Gary that was proposing to spy on and ruin Glenn Greenwald's reputation. I mean, now it turns out they don't need it because there's a bunch of progressives who'll do that for them on the internet.
Right, and by the way, just to interject, HB Gary, which was this firm, also proposed to spy on labor unions, Think Progress, where I used to work at Center for American Progress, and these firms were actually pitching a plan to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, probably the most powerful sort of corporate lobbying conglomerate. And that's a scandal, by the way, that has barely been touched by the wider media. My colleague Lee Fong at Think Progress and now at The Nation, wrote extensively about it. But I'm glad you brought that up, and it's certainly an example, I think, of how Hastings pays attention to something that often other people forgot. But please continue.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was, and now he's been, it sort of emerged that he was working on a piece about the Barrett Brown case. Barrett Brown, who is currently in prison in Texas on FBI charges. I think that Hastings had observed the combination of increased surveillance, increased crackdowns on whistleblowing and forms of electronic activism or hacking. The huge excessive kind of charges people have been faced with for that. The kind of the provoked terrorism charges that have been brought against activists in Chicago and Cleveland. I mean, all of that is a certain kind of climate that I'm not surprised that he was wanting to investigate, and it's very troubling because it means that it gets harder and harder for people who are going to do that kind of reporting to get the story out without repercussions to themselves.
And that brings up an interesting point what you just brought up. It was the WikiLeaks Twitter account who mentioned that it was a few hours actually before that night of the car crash that he had contacted, I think it was Jennifer Robinson, who's their lawyer. And I don't think she works exclusively for them, but she works for a number of clients, including WikiLeaks. And they had mentioned that he had told her that the FBI had been investigating Hastings. WikiLeaks never really followed up on that. Miss Robinson, who is actually on Twitter as well, didn't really follow up on it in any way. And so that story just sort of floating out there to see what that's about. It may very well be that he was suspicious that the FBI was investigating him because of his work, especially he was trying to do some writing about, I believe it was that gentleman Barrett Brown, a journalist who was actually connected to Anonymous, and some of her writing about Anonymous, which is sort of like the hacker collective, right? So that story can go any number of ways. I mean, Stephen, do you have any? I mean, do you think there's anything there? Do you think that maybe Hastings was suspicious of some possible FBI surveillance because of the nature of the stories that he was doing, particularly around national security?
Yeah, and I apologize because I'm gonna have to go in just a second. But I think it actually, I think he would have had to have been based on the reporting he had done earlier in his career, and this gets back to kind of the first thing we talked about with the elitist, kind of elitist mentality and elitist circles, and again, when you're in these situations, and one of the things that Hastings, that his articles were so helpful in bringing to light, was kind of the reality of these folks who inhabit these senior positions that contain massive power. I mean, Stanley McChrystal wasn't just the general in Afghanistan. Before that, he ran JSOC, which you talked about earlier, which is America's. I mean, it's the tip of the American military sphere. It's doing covert activity in kind of dozens and dozens of countries around the world. And what you see. And what Hastings reminded us is these are people, and they're people who can be petty, they're people who can be partisan, they're people who can be vindictive and manipulative. And when you amass the kinds of power in their hands, and then when you combine that with a media and a press corps that doesn't ask the very basic questions, that kind of gives a free pass, it's an incredibly dangerous situation. It's a situation that the only cure for is sunlight. The only cure for is public discourse. And unfortunately, we're all a little worse off because we won't have Michael to do that work for us in the future, and we can only hope that his work inspires kind of a generation of journalists to be more aggressive, be as passionate about seeking the truth and about exposing the realities that they find as he was. And so I think he absolutely would have been suspicious, and with good reason, because whether they were or they weren't, the security culture, the surveillance state, and the kind of massive power we've put in the hands of a few people who, at the end of the day, are people, that he, and all of which he saw firsthand in his career, is a really dangerous world, and we all owe him a bit of thanks for the great work to expose that he was able to do in his time that was unfortunately cut way too short.
Sure. No, that's absolutely true. As we start to wrap up, Rania, do you have any final words just that you want to say about Hastings, maybe a story or just what we can learn, I think, from his body of work?
I actually wanted to add to what your last guest was just saying about how shedding light on sunlight is the only cure, and that's what Hastings did. And I think that one thing that we have to remember is that, like, especially in the climate we're in right now, I mean, we're in a climate where the current administration is not only, like, we know that there's this massive spying program, right? But then, I mean, this current administration has also been at the head of, like, spying on journalists. I mean, the whole AP scandal that broke last month about, spying on journalists over a week, and the massive prosecution of whistleblowers, and more and more frequently journalists like Barrett Brown, because of the work they're doing. I think that all these things, I mean, just show that, the kind of work that Hastings was doing wasn't easy, and it was possibly a little bit dangerous in the sense that, like, depending on what he reported, who knows if he could have at some point ended up, being around to be prosecuted for reporting a leak, So I think it's just, he's totally somebody that we should all try and, be inspired by and emulate a lot of his tactics, and at the same time, like, remember that, like, no matter what happens, what happens in the future with the national security state, that, like, we're always going to need, the only way to dismantle it, if that's something that's important to you, is to have journalists like Michael Hastings, journalists like Brennan Greenwald, journalists like Jeremy Scahill, and now we're one less, really willing to do that kind of work, and sort of put their houses on the line. And I don't know, as a journalist, I'm just really inspired by Hastings' work, and I hope that I can be more like him.
No, absolutely, and I would echo everything you said. And Joe, just any last words as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that, whatever Hastings might have thought about the FBI surveilling him. We actually know, I mean, Truthout published a story on this last year, that DHS were having conversations about him after he wrote a piece on their monitoring of Occupy Wall Street, where they talked about, should we try and get him to take it down? And DHS were actually saying to each other, well, maybe one of us should give him a call and explain our reasoning and sort of bring him on our side, which is kind of a funny idea. I don't think that would have really worked. So the idea that he was being observed by government agencies, I mean, I'm sure he was to some extent. As Rania said, like, we know that's going on with journalists. So it seems strange that if that wasn't going on, whether there's anything more to it, I think it's too early to say. But just to change the focus a little, I mean, I because we did have friends in common, and because I was lucky enough to meet him, the thing that did strike me a lot, when you talk about Hastings being the best of us, and what a loss it is that for all he achieved, he really was incredibly down to earth and humble. And I kind of, I was looking at some of the other things that the people who had only met him a couple of times were saying online recently. And it seems to be a really common story that he sort of reached out to them when he was visiting their city, and kind of like, what is this fairly famous guy doing, contacting me, wanting to hang out? And this seems to be a recurring thing, and people who met him in other circumstances have said the same thing. And as I said in the piece about this that I wrote, a lot of journalists, for better or for worse, do have egos. It's often kind of part of their makeup, of their composition. And I'm not saying he didn't have any ego, but the sort of down to earth and sort of humble quality that he had when it came to meeting other people was really inspiring. And I think that's, in addition to his obvious proficiency and skills and courage, that's another thing that we can all kind of aspire to.
No, absolutely. And I want to thank Stephen Miles from Win Without War, Rania Khalek, an independent journalist, and Joe McCare from Truthout for letting us do this and having this special report on Michael Hastings, a brilliant, wonderful journalist, and maybe even a better human being who not only knew how to ask really tough, aggressive questions, but also how to listen to the stories that were important, that people needed to know about things ranging from Iraq and drone strikes to what was happening here at home in the presidential campaign. And I think all of us here in the journalistic and in the progressive communities will be remembering him and constantly be asking ourselves, what can we do to be more fearless, to be more brave in our own reporting, and to be more empathetic and to truly get out the stories that change the world in the way that Hastings did.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.